Soaring Shrike Blades of Death, Chapter 5. As soon as the sun was up the next morning, Doris entrusted the still slumbering Dan to the elderly physician and left the farm. "Are you dead set on going? Even supposing he's still alive, you've got no idea whether or not you'll find him." Doc was referring to D, of course. Doris kept her silence and smiled. It wasn't a disheartened smile. She'd save him all right, even if it killed her. That was the conviction that bolstered her smile. "Don't worry, we'll be back for sure. Take care of Dan for me." And with that, she wheeled her horse around toward the vampires' castle. She was scared. She'd already felt the vampire's baleful fangs once, and had nearly been attacked again scant hours earlier. And she'd already lost all memory of the effectiveness of garlic, having heard from Dr. Faringo that the Count had run off for some unknown reason. Doris assured herself the powder really had worked. As soon as she came to believe it, however, every memory of the powder was purged from her brain. In its place, Doris remembered how the previous night, the fearsome noble dealt with every attack she threw at him like it was mere child's play. The memory of it was etched vividly in her mind. She couldn't beat him. There was no way to stop him. While she raced across the plains with a display of equestrian skill that would put any man to shame, her heart was poised to drop into a pit of the darkest despair until the innocent face of her brother Dan caught her and pulled her back. "Don't worry. Your big sister ain't about to let that bastard get the best of her. I'll bring Dee back, and then we'll get rid of the lot of them," she thought. Beyond Dan's face, another face flickered. Colder than that of the Count, a visage so exquisite it gave her goosebumps. "Be alive. I don't care how bad you're hurt. Just please still be alive." Even after the weather controller's comfort control time was over, the chill-laden morn on the prairie was so beautiful and charged with vitality that the green of the landscape took on a deeper hue. A dozen men on horseback, looking like they'd ridden hard all night, kicked up a cloud of dust as they came to an abrupt halt on a road traversed only by a pleasant morning breeze. The road ran on into the village of Rensilva, stitching its way between prairies of waist-high grass. 70 feet ahead, 4 figures had sprung from the undergrowth, and now stood in the middle of the road, blocking the traveler's way. "What the hell are you trying to prove?" "We're the Frontier Defense Force, dispatched on orders from the capital. Out of our way." The eyes of the second man to shout narrowed cautiously. The outlandish appearance of this foursome touched on remembered dangers. The girlish little punk, the big freaking bastard, a bag of bones with a pointed head and a hunchback. You pricks wouldn't happen to be the fiend corpse, would you? An excellent deduction, Regense said with a grin wholly befitting the lush green morning. With that gem of a smile, it was hard to imagine the dashing youth as the head of the brutal bandit gang that had terrorized the northern part of the frontier. "We came down here to make a little money after our faces got a wee bit too well known up north. But before we can even get started, it comes to our attention you boys are going from village to village posting warrants for us. So we decided to wait for you out here. Kindly refrain from doing anything untoward." To the man, the members of the FDF were enraged by his insolent tone. The solemn-faced man who was apparently their commander barked, "Shut your damn flap." We made double time to Pedro's after we got word you pricks had been seen in town there. But we just barely missed you. Much to our regret. I can't believe our luck. You clowns just jumped into our laps. We're busting you right here. I don't care if you're the meanest bandits to ever walk the earth. You've all got to be soft in the head. You know we're the Frontier Defense Force, dumbass. His self-confidence wasn't a bluff. Dispatched by the capital at regular intervals to police the entire frontier, the FDF had been trained to combat all manner of beasts and creatures. They were equipped with serious firepower, and in a fight, each and every one of them was worth a platoon of normal men. Heavy metallic clinks echoed from the saddles of the squad members surreyed behind him. And that was the sound of shells being automatically fed into the recoilless bazookas each man was issued. The squad members already had Ray Ginsei and his group in the unswerving sights of their laser rifles. No matter how the bandits' battle in the saloon the previous day had defied imagining, it seemed unlikely that mortal men like themselves could weather the FDF's assault. How does this strike you? Since you went to all the trouble of turning yourselves in, we'll let you throw down your weapons, okay? That way you'll at least get to go on living till they get you up on the hangman's scaffold, said the commander. I don't fancy that. Why, you little punk. By all means, shoot me if it'll make you feel any better. But before you do, there's one thing you seem to be forgetting. The commander knit his brow in consternation. The Fiend Corps is not a quartet, Ray Ginsei said in an exquisite voice. What? A stir ran through the FDF members. At some point, the foursome had taken their eyes off the FDF and turned them straight to the side. We have a guardian angel the rest of the world knows nothing about. Still looking off to the side, Ray Ginsei pulled the corner of his lips up sharply. His was the devil's own smile. Ah, here it comes now. When an unremitting source of terror to the human body and soul appeared right in front of them, the degree of shock each of the victims felt seemed to be directly dependent on their proximity to it. The instant the thing materialized from thin air, hovering over the commander's horse, the leader died of shock, and the 5 FDF members within 10 feet of him went insane. And that wasn't all. Apparently even animals could see the thing, or perhaps they could sense its troubling presence. The lead horses forgot all about running away, but instead dropped to a spasming heap on the ground, frothing from the nose and mouth. The rest of the steeds reared up. Most likely, the FDF members who fell from their mounts as a result didn't cry out because part of their psyches had already been shattered. Some of them had their heads staved by the hooves of the rampaging horses, while others seemed frozen as they watched it coming closer and closer. The thing leisurely made its way from one survivor to the next, touching each of the members in turn. The capital's greatest fighting men quietly died of madness, powerless to stop it. Well, what do you think? The 5th member of the Fiend Corps is quite the lurker, isn't it? The last member of the FDF was crawling across the ground, but as he listened to Ray Ginsei's sardonic laughter, the thing suddenly vanished without a trace. What the? As the startled Ray Ginsei looked over his shoulder, the sole surviving FDF member trained his laser rifle on the bandit's forehead. Thanks to a Spartan training regime, he could still muster murderous intent toward the enemy despite his insanity. Boss! Before Golem could move, a beam of red light pierced Ray Ginsei's brow. However, It was the FTF member who jerked backwards. Incredibly, the laser beam that hit Reagan's say right between the eyes burst out of the back of the other man's head. A stench of seared flesh and brains hung in the otherwise refreshing air. "Are you okay, boss?" The man with the pointed head asked as he cast a loathsome gaze on the soldiers littering the ground. Not merely his head, but the man's entire frame was streamlined like a shooting star-class rocket. He was called Gimlet. "I believe I'll survive," Reagan laughed, rubbing his forehead. There was a black circle about a quarter-inch in diameter, scorched right between his eyebrows. While the others inquired no further after his condition, the four fiends looked at each other with concern over another suspicious occurrence. "Something must have happened to Witch," said the hunchbacked man. "Chilla's right," Reagan chimed in. "The only reason I made such a blunder is because I never in a million years imagined that thing just disappearing in the middle of an operation." He certainly had a strange way of covering his blunders. Turning back to the expanse of prairie to his left, he muttered, "If one of her spells should break at her age, she'll be walking the cold, dark road to hell." "Would you like me to go check it out?" asked Gimlet. He shook his head from side to side. "No. I shall look into this. The rest of you kindly dispose of these unsightly remains. Burn them or eat them, whichever suits your fancy," he said, smiling at his disturbing orders. First part, end. Second part. And this was what was happening while the gruesome battle neared its conclusion. Or rather, to be precise, just before the sudden disappearance of the thing that had materialized from thin air. Racing across the plains, Doris was just about to turn her steed in a new direction when she discovered something unexpected in some place unimaginable, and jerked her horse's reins in the opposite direction instead. This spot was less than 1.25 miles from Count Lee's castle. Bypassing the more circuitous roads, she'd galloped straight through a hilly region, but from here on out, she'd have to take a somewhat less direct route. Her father had brought her here just once when she was little, and she'd seen it from a distance then, but she'd never seen the place from this close before. Half of her frightened, the other half deadly serious, she took in the mysterious scenery stretching out in the morning light. The villagers called this place the Devil's Quarry. In this part of the endless expanse of prairie, there were countless statues standing like stone forests, or laying on the ground and looking to the heavens. No two had the same face or form, and there wasn't a single statue that didn't have the aspect of some bizarre monstrosity. A sculpture of a bald-headed man with incredibly large eyes, a bust of a creature with dozens of arms bearing its fangs, a full-length statue with thousands of beastly bristles, each individually carved. All these pieces of incomparably detailed craftsmanship were covered with moss, as were the remnants of stone walls and columns that called to mind the ruins of some ancient citadel. Together, they seemed to form a completely alien dimension. Even the morning sunlight, that should have breathed life into every hill and valley in the world, lent the faces of the sculptures weirder shadows than it might have, as the particles of light were swallowed by the moss and the desolate atmosphere, or sank with leaden weight. Even the air was dank. People said this was the place where the nobility had once held their wretched ceremonies, or a quarry used in the construction of the castle, but the latter theory was easily dismissed. After all, There wasn't any stone in this whole region to be quarried. At any rate, this was a forbidden area, and no one from the village ever entered. What had caught Doris's eye was an old woman seated in a deep, bowl-shaped depression near the center of the Devil's Quarry, doing the same baffling gestures over and over. Her age was unclear, judging by her gray hair and the wrinkles creasing her yellowed skin, both of which were obvious even at this distance. She looked to be nearly 100, and yet her body seemed strangely imbued with vitality. What is this? Some old lady lost in her travels, taking a breather? Even if Doris couldn't bring her all the way into town, she could at least give the woman directions back to the main road. But as Doris was just about to give her mount a flick of the reins, she stayed her hand and quietly slipped down to the ground instead. Wrapped in a dull gray overcoat, the crone's torso was bent forward at an extreme angle, and there was something about the sight of her, with eyes fixed on her own fingertips as they clutched at nothing, that just felt evil. Of course, Doris was completely unaware that at that very moment, on the road a few miles distant, a strange entity that appeared out of thin air was busy delivering death by insanity to the members of the FDF. Muffling her own footfalls as she led her horse, Doris made her way into the Devil's Quarry, tethered her mount to a nearby pillar, and came up behind the crone. Apparently the old woman didn't notice, as she didn't move at all. As Doris drew closer, she felt goosebumps spread across her flesh. A poisonous miasma was rising from the crone's vicinity. Clearly she was using some arcane skill toward foul ends. The sound of a low voice chanting a spell reached Doris's ears. "Stop that!" she shouted despite herself as she took a few steps forward. At that instant, something whizzed out of the bushes and glanced off her cheek. Doris dropped to the ground with lightning speed. Holding her breath and remaining alert, she touched her left hand to her cheek. Warm blood clung to her fingertips. A spirit beast, eh? Looks like she's got a warded zone set up right around here, Doris thought. To her left, Doris felt a keen presence. She made a quick combat roll to one side and let fly with the whip in her right hand. Unfortunately, her deadly strike only kicked grass into the air, but she sensed her opponent changing direction to fall back a good distance. When conjurers and sorcerers work their art, they established an area around themselves with a radius of 10 or so feet in order to have the best chances of success. This was known as their warded zone. Since their concentration might be disturbed, and, in extreme cases, their spell might even lose its efficacy if someone were to step into this zone while they were working, sorcerers conjured up creatures and set them as watchdogs outside the warded zone, ready to attack intruders. The task often fell to massive hounds, poisonous toads, and serpents suckled on pure malice. But this crone used a transparent creature formed of her own force of will, a spirit beast, and a particularly nasty one at that. Doris was well aware the only thing that had saved her was the superb reflex of a trained hunter. The average person would have had their throat torn open a few seconds ago. In her heart, she whispered thanks to her father. "It's 40 feet to the old lady. Guess this calls for a bit of trickery," Doris muttered to herself. This dangerous gamble was her only choice. She had no idea what kind of misery her opponent could be causing with her spell. Once again, her whip mowed through open air right toward the crone. Slashing through the air, the spear beast attacked Doris. And at that moment, her whip snapped back. An instant later, she could feel something in the air rip in half. The air was suddenly flooded with a choking malevolence, but it dispersed quickly enough. Ah! The scream that escaped the crone as she doubled over made Doris leap to her feet in the brush. Doris had drawn the spear beast out by appearing to attack the crone, and then used a flick of her wrist to turn the blow on the beast at the last possible second. Of course, if her timing had been off by a split second, Doris would have been the one to die. Her suicidal gamble had paid off, but it also had an unforeseen side effect. Because the crone had created the spear beast with her own sorcery, the destruction of the beast meant a disturbance to her other spell as well. She invested the whole of her life force in performing that spell, and when it was broken, the crone's black heart beat its last. It was at just that moment the outlandish creature bearing down on the last remaining FTF member vanished. "Hey, lady. Come on, snap out of it." Doris raced over and took her in her arms, but the crone's eyes showed dead white. Foam spilled from her mouth, and the mortified look on her wrinkled features defied description. There was a pentagram branded on her forehead, the mark of a sorceress. Damn it. This isn't quite what I had in mind. Though this was an evil sorceress, and her own actions had clearly been in self-defense, the thought that she'd brought about the death of an old woman weighed heavily on Doris's heart. "I'm sorry, but you'll have to wait here until I can come back. I've got serious business to attend to." Doris laid the corpse out on the ground, and was about to head back to her horse when she hesitated. She'd already decided that finding out whether or not Dee was okay was more important than bringing this corpse back to town. She'd come out here aware of all the risks that entailed. Still, the dark body of the crone looked so terribly sad and forlorn, stretched out on the ground. The wind tugged at the sleeves of her overcoat, and a corpse abandoned in the wilds was a tempting target for monsters. It would be bad enough to have them feasting on her, but if one of them got inside her, that would be yet another threat to humanity. Even in broad daylight, there were probably some creatures around that might risk turning into a ball of flame to slink out and take possession of a corpse that hadn't been disposed of properly. Doris didn't have any of the gear she'd need to take care of the body. She didn't see a horse or wagon for the crone. On inspection, the inner pocket of the crone's overcoat contained nothing aside from a few suspicious-looking trinkets. Doris went back to the body and lifted it gently. "I don't really think there are any critters to take you over out here, but I'm going to bring you with me anyway. Of course, I can't offer any guarantees we'll make it back in one piece either." Loading the corpse onto the horse behind the saddle, Doris used rawhide lacing to secure its arms and legs around the steed. That was to keep it from falling off, and just to be safe in the event that something did possess it. Leave it to the daughter of a hunter to be accustomed to this sort of work. She had the whole thing done in less than 3 minutes. Doris got in the saddle. "At any rate, I'll make for the main road." When her horse had gone but a few steps, Doris suddenly spun around. At the same moment, she heard a thunk as something heavy buzzed by at neck level. The decapitated head painted a gory parabola as it sailed through the air, and just before it hit the ground, its eyes snapped open. It bared its teeth. They were the eyes of a demon, and the foul fangs of one as well. It flew toward the person responsible for separating it from its body. Black lightning streaked from a mounted figure topping a hill quite some distance off. Split in two from forehead to chin, the crone's head fell to the ground and moved no more. Doris realized she'd had a very close call. Right behind her was the decapitated corpse of the crone, frozen in place with its claws a heartbeat away from tearing into the girl's throat. The snap binding dangled from its wrists. An evil spirit had possessed the corpse before Doris had even touched it. The instant it snapped its bonds to attack Doris from behind, the figure on the distant hill had lopped the head off with consummate skill and speed. Her horse gave a shake, and the headless corpse dropped to the ground. And Doris finally turned to face her savior. "Oh, Dee, I was—" An elated hue lit up her face, but it was gone all too soon. While the figure coming down off the hill, fresh from its graceful display of skill, certainly had beauty on par with Dee, he was clearly someone else. "I can't believe you picked up on that." As he pulled up alongside her on his horse, Regense smiled blindingly. He was referring to how she had sensed a strange presence, and turned around a split second before the possessed corpse attacked. "And that was nothing. It looks like I mean you're dead again. What kind of weapon did you use?" Regense took a playfully surprised expression at her less than ladylike query. "If you'll forgive my saying so, judging by your clothing and that whip, you appear to be a hunter." "My father was. I just sort of play at it," Doris said without embarrassment or modesty, and then she smiled. She wasn't entirely sure why, but her smile felt strangely forced. Realizing that even after they exchanged civilities, Doris's eyes were not focused on his face, but rather on his weapon-girt waist, the dashing youth smiled grimly. "What brings you here, of all places, at this hour of the morning, sir? You've been out on the road." "Yes, that's it exactly." "In that case, you suppose you could bring this old lady's body back into town for me? Normally I'd have to go and explain what happened to the sheriff, but the truth is, I'm kind of in a hurry." And Doris stopped her horse and proceeded to recount the entire incident. Listening silently until the end, Regense then muttered, "I see now. So that's what happened to it. I can take care of the corpse for you. I shall see to it both are disposed of properly." "Both?" Doris knit her brow, but as the dashing youth's carefree smile struck her, she reflected a smile of her own. "Okay then. Thanks." As she was reining her horse around, her arm was grabbed from the side, drawing the lovely young woman into an embrace on horseback. The sweet aroma that lingered around his mouth wasn't what you'd expect from a man. "What the hell?" "I've saved your life, even though it meant slaying one of my 4 companions. Of course, you're also quite beautiful. And then there's the matter of your rescue yesterday. I hardly think anyone would blame me for taking a little compensation. You'd better leave me alone. Or else. You've also seen something you shouldn't have. We really can't have you going into town and telling everyone about that. So you'll have to die out here. Why don't we just say I'm avenging my fallen comrade? Don't put up such a fight. You'll live a while longer. Until I've taken my pleasure, at least. The dashing youth's mouth locked over the virgin's lips. There was a gasp, and Ray Ginsei quickly pulled back. He pressed his hand to his mouth, and blood spread across the back of it. A bite from Doris had torn his lips open. Don't screw with me. I've got someone I care about. I wouldn't let a creep like you touch me. Her tone was awe-inspiring. She thought Ray Ginsei's countenance would flush with anger, but he simply smiled. Only it wasn't the charming smile that people couldn't help but return. It was a satanic grin he'd worn on the main road. Giving a shudder, Doris lashed her whip at the center of his face. Less than 1.5 feet lay between them. It was really too close to swing the whip. And yet the swirl of black from the girl's fist led right up at the youth's dashing face. It was about to land there when it disappeared into the black streak of lightning shooting up from her foe's waist. Ray Ginsei's skill in drawing his bizarre V-shaped weapon and slashing off the end of her whip in the blink of an eye was truly miraculous. And yet, his face had none of the tension of a battle about to be joined, but rather held the same smile as before. Yeah! Realizing in a heartbeat she didn't stand a chance of victory, Doris reined her horse toward the ruins and took off at full speed. In her haste to take flight, she forgot the might of her foe's weapon, and the weight had taken off the crone's head from a hilltop over 60 feet away. Ray Ginsei didn't throw his weapon immediately. As Doris's mount neared the heart of the ruins, he finally let the weapon fly with an underhanded throw. Whirring as it chased down the rapidly dwindling speck of Doris and her steed, it mercilessly slashed through the horse's right rear leg and right front leg, turned a graceful loop, and came right back at them, severing both legs on the left side. As the loss of one leg would have sufficed to prevent the girl's escape, this was a display of sheer brutality. A bloody mist went out as the horse fell. Oh, just beautiful. As he felt the weight of his weapon returning to his outstretched palm, Ray Ginsei admired the scene before him. As the horse toppled over, a lithe body leapt into the air, somersaulted, and landed on the ground with only the slightest break in form. But Doris's face was deathly pale. She hadn't forgotten her foe's weapon, or his unholy skill with it. With those very things in mind, she had her horse galloping along a zigzagging course. The black weapon seemed to take their movements into consideration nonetheless as it cleanly severed the first 2 legs. The falling beast threw them into the air as Ray Ginsei came back and visited a similar fate on the remaining pair. Doris realized she'd run into a foe that in some ways was even more fearsome than the nobility. There was a javelin and a longsword strapped to her saddle, but she had the whip in her right hand. Still, the weapon felt strangely light and ineffectual in her grasp. Ray Ginsei leisurely rode into the ruins. After seeing that last display of agility, I found myself even less inclined to kill you soon. Will you not lay with me before you depart this mortal coil? Who'd be low enough to do that? I'd sooner have my head bashed open on one of these rocks than lie down for a self-important snake like you. Doris replied, quickly slipping behind the closest of the massive sculptures. Almost 20 feet high, The statue of a figure with a pair of bared fangs tilted slightly forward, set off balance by the long years and the shifting of the ground. Reagan's intimidating ranged weapon couldn't be expected to do much through the stony shield, but with no way to strike back, Doris remained in the same predicament. The stronger the prey, the greater the huntsman's thrill. Even more so when it's such an exquisite beast. Oh, I'm sorry. You're supposed to be a hunter as well, aren't you? Reagan ended the question with scornful laughter. The second he looked down from that hill and spotted Doris with Witch's body loaded on her horse, he had decided to kill her. If the connection were made between the disappearance of the FDF squad and the corpse of an old woman who had been working some sort of sorcery, it would only be a question of time before the name of his gang came up. Which had been like a reserve unit no one knew about. Operating independently, her job was to summon a creature more ghastly than the human mind could bear. Her creations left the bandits' foes psychologically devastated. When Reagan lopped off the head of the demonically possessed witch and saved Doris, part of the reason was because of the natural sexual attraction he felt toward the beautiful girl. On the other hand, he'd also intended to get rid of the burdensome old sorceress eventually. Now he had the girl cornered like an animal. She was largely unscathed, and her eyes blazed with animosity as she glared at him from behind the monolith. It would be so easy for me to send you into the hereafter, but I fear dispatching you so quickly would leave you ill-equipped to testify to my infamy in the afterlife. The weapon in his right hand glistened in the sunlight. I believe I shall have to make your frail heart quake a bit more in fear of me. Ah, yes. I recall one of the cardinal rules of the hunter. First, you must flush the elusive prey from its hiding place. Something howled through the air, and there was an incredible noise from the base of the monolith sheltering Doris. And giving a cry of astonishment, Doris wisely leapt out of the way. Stuck in the ground at an angle, the several tons of sculpted stone didn't look likely to budge an inch, even under a sizable impact. But suddenly its balance seemed to upset, and it started to tilt in her direction. The weapon that had done this was already back in Reagan's hand. It resembled the boomerang the ancient natives of Australia used so effectively. Unlike the boomerang, however, Reagan's weapon was razor sharp on both the inner and outer edges. What's more, it was made of iron. Most non-Aborigines had trouble throwing a plain wooden boomerang effectively, yet this handsome youth, as limber as a sapling swaying in the breeze, could throw the iron blades any way he pleased with just one flick of the wrist. His unholy skill lent blades of mere metal the kind of cutting power reserved for magic swords, pushing them through a human body, or the trunk of a tree, or even through stone. Furthermore, they didn't just strike in a straight line. They could come at the target from the right or the left, from above, even from the feet. There seemed to be nowhere they couldn't go. And while it was impossible to defend oneself from even one of these blades, it seemed unlikely there was anyone in the world that could fend off 2 or 3 successive attacks, let alone multiple blades thrown at the same time. The iron blades were liable to slice through any shield as easily as they went through their usual prey. Such were Reagan's shrike blades. The ground shook, and verdant moss flew everywhere as the monolith fell. Doris stood at the bottom of a lush green bowl of a depression, stock still with amazement. It was 10 feet to the nearest stone wall. Swaying like a flower in the morning breeze, Regense laughed. "What's wrong? I thought the nature of the beast was to flee when hunted." Suddenly, he swallowed his words. Doris's expression filled with hope, because two things had suddenly changed. A heavy white mist from nowhere in particular had begun to fill the ruins. It clung to Regense's hand as he held his weapon, and to Doris's cheeks, forming tepid beads. And far off, a horse was whinnying. Doris made a mad dash for the stone wall. While the fog might protect her from an attack, she didn't think it would blind her foe long enough for her to get away. She would try to get close enough to whoever was riding the horse she'd just heard to call out, and would try to borrow some weapons, though she might lose an arm or a leg in the process. Of course, she didn't think that would be enough to beat him anyway. Nothing came knifing through the air after her. Leaping over the wall head first, she held her breath and tried to judge the distance to the next bit of cover. The voice that echoed across the distance rendered her determined gaze as lifeless as that of a corpse. "Boss, I'm gonna help myself to your playmate." In a dimly lit world, where a dripping white veil hid the blue of the sky, the shadow of death crept ever closer to the one lone girl. Regense and his 3 henchmen, any one of them was more than a match for her. "What happened to Witch, boss?" Another voice inquired. "She got put down. Lost her head to a pretty little bird." A low, rumbling stir went through the fog. The voices she heard were choked with blackest rage. "I'll gouge her eyes out. I'm gonna twist arms and legs off her. I'll tear her head off." And then Regense was heard to say, "And I shall take my pleasure from what remains of her body." Doris hadn't spoken. She couldn't even be heard to breathe. The men had simply sensed the presence of a girl paralyzed by imminent death. The milky fog reduced everything to vague silhouettes. Regense held a shrike blade ready in his right hand. Without a single word of prompting, something else was somewhere in the fog. Golem drew his machete, a bowie knife gleamed in Gimlet's hand, and Chola's hump split in half. Well now. Just as they were about to unleash their murderous assault, Regense suddenly froze. There's something out there. Yes, out in the eddying mist. Out in the sticky, unsettling fog that steadily gnawed away at their psyches, which soaked through their skin to threaten the flame of life. Regense clearly sensed the presence of something other than his group in their helpless prey. Not only was there something out there, but it was enough to stop a man like him in his tracks. Regense couldn't physically see it, but he felt the presence near the monolith he toppled with his lightning-fast throw. He hadn't known anything about this. How could he have guessed the monolith had stood there since time immemorial, blocking an entrance to the subterranean world? The fog around them was one that had risen from the bowels of the earth. "So this is the outside world?" The query came in just the sort of unsettling voice one would expect from a demon of the mists. It had such an inhuman ring to it that Regense and his 3 brutal henchmen found themselves swallowing nervously. Stranger yet, it was a woman's voice. "It's so chilly. I like it so much better down below," said another woman. A third said, "We really must find something to fill our bellies. Oh, well, isn't there something right over there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in all." Regense shuddered. realizing that the three speakers could see perfectly well in the fog that left all others blind. Due to the weirdness of the presence he sensed out there, he'd forgotten all about lowering the shrike blade he'd raised earlier. He felt there were two things out there, and yet he couldn't help thinking that one of those was split into three. Your guide duties have been fulfilled. Get below again. A rusty but much more human voice commanded. No doubt that was the other presence he felt. But while the voice was more human, the presence itself was far more daunting than the source of the disturbing female voices. Oh, you can't. Look at how handsome he is. He looks absolutely delicious. Quickly surmising that these plaintive cries referred to himself, Reagan got chills. No, I forbid it. He felt extremely thankful for this second command. Let us go, my sisters. We have our orders. It's such a waste, but I suppose we must. But, well, when shall you visit us again? When will you come to our abode far below, O beloved one? The last voice was entreating. There was no response, and before long the strange thing with three voices and one presence moved reluctantly through the fog and disappeared back underground. The source of the remaining presence spoke. I'm not interested in fighting anyone but the nobility. But if you're hell-bent on starting something, then step right up. He's challenging us. Even with this realization, the quartet found that their will to fight remained weak. Dee, I know it's you, isn't it? Dora sounded on the verge of tears. Come to me. Relax. There's no need to hurry. Out in the fog, there was a sound of teeth grinding together. He said there was no need to hurry because he was sure the quartet wouldn't do a thing to stop him. The gnashing teeth testified to the gang's resentment of his scathing insult. But the fact of the matter was the unearthly aura radiating from somewhere out in the fog bound the villains tight, preventing them from so much as lifting a finger. The little bird that had almost been in hand walked over to the source of the voice. Shortly after that, the bandits felt the two of them moving far away. Wait just a minute. At long last, Reagan succeeded in forcing words from his mouth. At least tell me your name. Forgetting his customary eloquence, he shouted into the fog. So, is that your name, jerk? D? There was no response, and he felt the pair getting further and further away. The spell over him was broken. With a scream, Reagan hurled his weapon. Extraordinary in its power, speed, and timing, nothing could stop it. With complete confidence in that fact, he let the shrike blade fly. Out in the fog, there was a sound of blade meeting blade. After that, there was no sound at all, and silence settled over the white world. All trace of the pair was gone. Boss? Golem inquired dejectedly a few minutes later, but the beautiful spawn of hell-sent supplications just stayed there, with his right hand stretched out for a shrike blade that never returned, his countenance paler than the fog as he sat frozen in the saddle. Second part, end.